to the third and final installment of this week's episode of Midrash Rabba 2.0, Vayigash. When we draw near with an understanding that we are not our creator. That is what we're about to discuss. So we have next the Rabbi's Nugget. And if you have been watching and you saw the last installment of this Midrash, you will know that I left it with what is so big? What's the big deal about Goshen? Now, in order to really grasp this, in order to really step into this, I need to share some things with you. And so the first thing that I need to do is we need to discuss this week's parasha. And for those of you who have keen minds, you're probably going to catch on to this pretty quick. So let's go ahead and go back to 44:18, which is where this parasha starts. Now, a couple things that I want you to think about. The first, and this is important, is that this is Judah approaching, right? It says, and Judah cometh nigh, but if you go into the NASB, it says in verse 18, then Judah approached him and said, in the Hebrew, this word is Vayigash, from the root word nagash, okay? Nagash. Now, what you need to know is that when there is because of the nasal sound, when there are Hebrew words that start with a noon and jump to a gimel, it makes the ng sound, right? And that's a very difficult transition when you have infixes, prefixes, and suffixes attached to the word. And the reason for that is because in a more distinct ancient Semitic dialect, the vowels are not present. It's a very consonant-based pronunciation, which means it's a matter of stops and not vowel points. So whereas in English, where we really, really put a lot of emphasis on our vowels when we speak, think of Hebrew as a more consonant pronounced. So this, instead of this being pronounced as this man,
Strong's H 5066, Nagash.
First of all, we'll just tell you for the record that is a very inappropriate pronunciation of that word. It is not Nagash. It is Na, N-A-W, Gosh, G-A-H-S-H. Okay? So it's Nagash, not Nagash. But having said that, there are people who will contend with me that that's the pronunciation, but really what it is Ngush. Okay? Ngush. And so when you want to say things like, I will draw near or approach, it is going to be pronounced Yingush. You could see where the N starts to become a problem. And so if I say, I will draw near, I say Yigish. Yigish. Okay? So what's important here is that there's a little bit of an sound in the pronunciations, unless we have a ayin or an aleph, and where the language of biblical Hebrew claims to have a sounds is really the difference between a full or not full pronunciation of consonants. For example, na gosh, right? As opposed to ngush. All right. So there's no aleph present here, but my point is that in the Hebrew, when you see this word, the noon is missing. Okay. What we call assimilated. The noon is assimilated, and the noon verbs that start with a noon, some of them have treatments that have to do with the weakness of the verb. For example, if I was to use the word natan as an example, let's talk about that really quick. So natan or ntan is basically a noon tav noon. Okay. I don't say ye natan. I say yitan when I say I will give. Okay. So I think it's important that sometimes that noon gets assimilated. So even though that this is pronounced Vayigash, there's an assumed noon in the original root verb. The verb is nagash, and it means to draw near. And I want to take a look at first usage. Genesis 18:23. Abraham approached and said, "Will you indeed sweep away the righteous with the wicked?" That's right. Vayira, one of the most powerful parashas of all of Torah, or at least of the first book of Torah, is Vayira, and he appeared. And very specifically, it's the discussion about Sodom and Gomorrah and its destruction. Then it appears again in chapter 19. And it says, but they said, "Get out of the way," right? Well, what does it actually say? It says, they also, this one came in as a foreigner, and already he is acting like a judge, and now we will treat you worse than them. So they pressed hard against Lot and moved forward, drew near to break the door. And they said, "Draw near," right? Draw near. Now, Isaac said to Jacob, "Please come near and close so that I may feel you, my son, whether you are really my son Esau or not." And then Jacob in Genesis 27:22, Jacob came near and close to his father Isaac. Genesis 27:25. So he said, "Bring near to me, and I will eat of my son's game, that I may bless you." And he brought near it to him, and he ate. Then his father Isaac said to him, "Please come close and kiss me, my son." So he came close. Genesis 29:10. So Jacob went near and rolled the stone from the mouth of the well, right? Genesis 33:3. But he himself passed on ahead of them and bowed down to the ground 7 times as he came near to his brother. And then Genesis 33:6. Then the slave women came near. And then Leah likewise came near, and then approached Joseph's house steward and spoke to him at the entrance of the house. In Genesis 44:18, then Judah approached him. So what's two very important elements that are present in this? The drawing near is in a state of humility, and the drawing near is to an authority. When Isaac says, come near, and Jacob draws near, he's drawing to his father, as in he's approachable. So, two elements that need to be present in the thought process. Element number one is that it has to be a person in a position of authority, which means what? The drawing near is something inappropriate in most cases. You don't draw near to an authority. This is that principle of you go and sit yourself at the place of honor. No, you sit at the end of the table and are invited to the position of honor. And to really understand that concept, we need to understand who is supposed to be seated at the place of honor. You see, the right hand is actually the position of authority. Let me explain. Unlike American Protestant democracy-based social equality, where people maintain their sovereignty and people maintain their authority regardless of who they are, in Hebrew thought, once you have passed the staff to your son and sent him to the field to shepherd, you step down as clan leader. And he becomes the owner and the business manager. And it ceases to be agency. Now, here's the crazy part about it. Are you still authority? Yes, over one single part, that son. But your house falls under the rulership of your son. Now, that means that the position of honor is actually the position of authority by which the sovereign steps aside and allows the right hand or the son of your right hand to take control of the inheritance while you're still alive. See, in probate, let me tell you something. When I studied law, contracts was a book that thick. Real estate law was a book that thick. Probate law was a book that thick. Probate law is one of the most driest and boring subjects in the history of American law. And interestingly enough, is all about who the junk goes to when a person dies. That's it. If there's a will, that goes through probate court and makes the adjustments and gives the distributions and all that, right? That's all probate is. But in Hebrew thought, the father gets to watch his child take control of the inheritance before he dies, which is so important because what does Yahweh promise Jacob when he has the vision? Joseph will close your eyes. Meaning what? Joseph will be your firstborn. That is missed, totally lost in translation, because Reuben is the firstborn of physical blood. But Yahweh's been establishing a pattern. You see, Haran was older than Avram, but Avram received the covenant. Isaac was younger than Ishmael, but Isaac received the covenant. The second born is not supposed to receive the inheritance, but Yahweh was itching at something. He was trying to reveal it, and it was like he was gnawing at the bit to try to get people to understand it. And finally, in next week's parasha, it becomes real. And that's a taste of what's to come. But now we need to understand that the transference of ownership passed from the staff of authority to the son of your right hand is the inheritor. Okay? That is one of the reasons why Benjamin is named son of my right hand. Remember, Rachel, named him son of my pain, but Jacob renamed him son of my right hand. But then he starts sending Joseph out. And Joseph ends up kidnapped and blah, blah, blah. But this is the part that's so important about this. And that is that when you draw near to a position of authority, you need permission to sit there. And that's why that proverb says, sit at the end of the table and be invited to that position. Why? Because that position is not contingent upon bloodline. Remember, Abraham says, the one who will inherit my house is the servant. So how can this covenant be when nothing has come out of my loins yet? There has been no child of my loins. And so he asks that of Yahweh. And Yahweh says, no, it is not going to be this man of inheritance. It's not, we are not going to invite your servant to the head of the table to sit at your right hand. It will be from your loins, right? Okay, so now you understand that being allowed to approach is being permitted to be in a position of honor, right? Okay, now watch this. Now, the next thing that's important here is the instructions given by Joseph after Judah. So it's interesting. Judah approaches Joseph. Now, I want you to think about this. Firstborn, right? Firstborn. Meaning what? Meaning that Judah held the firstborn status through action and through commitment, through taking responsibility, as it were. Reuben holds the bloodline firstborn status, but demonstrates that he cannot, he keeps trying to do it in the wrong way, through an ego process. Judah goes through a state of exile as a result of selling Joseph to Mitzrayim. Now, what I want you to think about is, in hindsight, was Joseph supposed to be sold to Egypt? Well, we get into that when we get into the question about, was Bathsheba supposed to be David's wife, right? Same principle, same concept. One way or another, Solomon was going to come from Bathsheba's blood and David's blood. Not Abigail, not Michal, of all people. Now, there's a number of reasons why that's true, and I don't necessarily want to get into that today, but what I want to get into is the principle that there is a plan and your behavior causes adjustments, but the goal is still present. The purpose is still present. And I'm going to propose to you that that is something that you get into agreement with before you ever come here. That you actually confer with God about the plan. So that when you get here, you can't get mad about it. Because somebody who's born missing a limb or somebody who's born to go through a hell of a childhood gets mad at God. And I'm sure that there are times when that gets really kind of difficult to navigate. And I'm going to propose to you that I don't really care. I shouldn't say I propose to you. I don't really care whether you believe that or not. Whether you had a plan with God before you got here, a plan that would include the sovereignty of yours and his decision together. But I'm going to propose to you that that's the true sovereignty of God. I'm going to propose to you that this has always been about joining God and naming the animals. I'm going to propose to you that everything happens exactly the way it's supposed to. However, our decisions, our life decisions constantly deviate from that path, and we have to kind of work our way back around. If I did not live in a state of existence where I believed this to be true, I would tell you that I don't know if I would believe it, but I've lived it in a state of realization that what I should have been 25 some years ago, I am right now, if I would have just stayed on the path and done the things the way in which they inside of me instinctually were supposed to be done. I had this intuition and I would just not listen to it. Now, why is this so important? Well, because in its simplicity, Joseph had to go to Egypt because there was something in Egypt that no other culture had, and that was the Nile. They had such a powerful position as a corner lot to the Mediterranean and the Nile. They had the most powerful crops. And they had also discovered, because of the alkalinity of the Nile, that they had to filter the water before they could irrigate plants. And that irrigation system created one of the most powerful growing systems in the history of mankind, aquaponics. They could grow plants in water, in sand. And so they no longer had to worry about the fertility of soil. They had everything they needed to make this beautiful, fertile plain of crops. And here's the crazy part about it. They were positioned to be a provider to the rest of the world, the known world at that time, when some sort of very bad thing hit the entire earth. The entire world was without food except for Egypt. And that's what needs to be understood. Now, again, I don't want to get outside my lane. I'm not an Egyptologist, and I don't know all of the sciences, and I don't know all of the elements that go into that concept. And I'm probably sure there are archaeologists and anthropologists who say there's no record of that anywhere in any of the cultures of humankind. Well, those are the same people who say there wasn't a flood. Okay. All right. So when we are navigating this, it's important to understand that you can take a story and you can read it and you can see the life decisions of a person and begin to try to make life decisions that are similar. But if you do that, you don't realize that that's a dangerous thing. Torah was not written as literal lifestyle choice instruction in the sense of these stories. You are not supposed to sell your brother to the Ishmaelites.
I highly recommend not doing that.
And yet it says it was written for our sakes as instruction. It never says non-instruction. There's no negation particle behind Torah. It doesn't say lo Torah. It says Torah, teaching and instruction of God, which means selling our brother to the Ishmaelites, we are instructed to do. But we darn well better figure out what that means. Now let's take it a step further. It is the breath of God. It is the voice of God. It is the will of God. And therefore, those instructions are not literal or in a physical plane in which they can be applied in such a way to have their most effectiveness. Why? Because we are spiritual beings having a human experience. And that particular being is an energy being, not a physical entity with hands and feet and eyes and ears and a mouth and emotions. It's a consciousness that has an intensification and source of all energy that exists in the universe. Meaning what? Meaning consequently, Torah is an energy vector. Quite literally, it is a trail of energy to follow. And that trail of energy to follow is literally about the concept of this consciousness, an energy that has intelligence and therefore intent, and for some reason has this concept of making itself as relatable as possible to the human experience. And so we hear father, husband. Who is Israel? The bride of the Creator. Who is Jacob? The Son of God. And here's the important part about that. Jacob is the inheritor. Israel is the covenant guarantee. You see, Jacob has a land covenant, a promise from God that he would return to this place and that Joseph would close his eyes. But Israel has a marriage covenant of food, clothing, and conjugal rights. And in this way, do we understand a depth behind this? But what's more is an understanding that the table fellowship that he entered into in Beersheba has to do with Vayigash. The promises that Yahweh made to him has to do with Vayigash, because what you are about to find out is that Jacob is sent to Egypt in order for him to become the bride. He goes down as the son of God, a covenant, a land covenant. There in a covenant, there is always a vassal and there is always a king. The land covenant will have the king as the greater, and the vassal will be the lesser. The vassal will be in a state of agency, and the king will be in a state of sovereignty. The vassal will be in a state of jurisdiction, and the king will be in a state of ownership. And so in a covenant, there's always a greater and a lesser. And oftentimes the lesser approaches the covenantor in order to receive status as a covenantee so that he doesn't destroy him. And when we get into the concept that anything that exists within the presence of God ceases to exist because it attains to the light, and the light is the creator, therefore there ceases to be an existence. Remember, I've demonstrated when I've drawn the two flames together, how they become one flame. There is no more definition of the two flames. Even if I had two different colored candles, the flame is going to be the same color, and it's going to be one singular flame. There's no two there. You can't see a division. So drawing near results in echad. You say, well, how is this possible? Because the bride has to go down under the overshadowing of the husband in covenant covering, which causes two very important points to come forward. Number one, she has to accept in her sovereignty her agency, and she has to accept in her jurisdiction his ownership. The reason why this is so important is because if you can best someone in battle, you are the authority. But that one who lost in battle becomes your protection. Now, we could get into all kinds of things about the indenturing and tributes and all that other stuff. But the short version of this is that she, as a willful, powerful being, becomes bound first. So Israel has to go down into binding. It says, and this man took for himself a wife, and he went into her, and she became his bride. It's not until there is an entering of her that she actually becomes his bride. Sure, there's all kinds of public commitments and covenant and ketubas and witnesses, but until that act occurs, there's no bride. And finally, and this is important, is in the process of the binding, she will become a vessel, a stable vessel, ready to be filled. But when she becomes filled, she becomes a kalala. So she goes, Yichal, Kil, Kali, Kalala. Okay? And in that process, there's a changing of garments. And in that process, there's a changing of status. And with it comes a protection that was so important to Abraham that he was able to actually preserve the covenant of God through stating that she is my sister. And Pharaoh dealt with the bride of Avram in the way in which the presentation occurred, but the plagues proved that Pharaoh knew. And that's what people don't realize. Because I want to remind you that plagues accompany infestation, even to the positive. What do I mean by that? That means that if you have someone like Abraham walk into a wicked city, that city begins to prosper for Abraham's sake, but they will not be in a state of covenant relationship with God, and therefore God will bring judgment upon that city and deliver Abraham out of it. But while Abraham is present there, while a covenanted being is present, everything around it prospers. So now, if I was able to show you that this word is repeated over and over and over and over again, that this was the state in which Jacob had to be in order to become the vessel that would eventually become the bride. because we know that the covenant that was broken, according to Jeremiah 31 through 33, was a marriage covenant, but also was the covenant that was made when what? He led them by the hand out of binding. So now we can see that one of the most powerful themes in all of Scripture is actually the marriage. And what's really important is that that is the process throughout. Over and over and over again, you're going to see this. You're going to see this pattern play out. You're going to see that Jacob going down into Egypt and coming up out of Egypt is all a part of this mapping or this model that's being introduced, where God is biting at the bit for people to grasp. So first of all, what we need to do is go in and examine that this same word. I'm just going to share my screen exactly where we were. Because what I want you to see is this right here. I want you to see this. I want you to see that Nagash is the concept of approaching a woman in bed. Now, Judah approaches Joseph by the Torah using the word Nagash here. He is stating, or Torah is stating, that Judah acknowledged Joseph's authority and humbly draws near to him. He comes to the head of the table where Joseph is sitting as king and seats himself at the right hand. A presumptuous state, but Judah has to, because he has the Messiah in his loins, and he has to deliver the inheritor. He has to deliver the son of Jacob's right hand. He has to set him free from this servitude because of what would happen to his father. That evil would find him. And now you understand that question better. But then something else happens. Joseph, talking to his brothers, says, "Please come closer." And they came closer. Wouldn't it be something if the same word was being used? So now Joseph says, "You may approach the place of honor." And they did. And you wonder why they are able to call themselves the sons of Israel. Right? They call themselves the sons of Israel, carried Jacob. Right? And Jacob descends. Jacob goes down to Egypt. Okay? Now, I want you to see this. So Joseph is dealing kindly with his brothers, right? And so he says right here, he says, "Do not be grieved or angry with yourselves." Let's just go see what that says in the Hebrew. Do not be angry or grieved with yourselves is actually in the reflexive. It is in the it is I'm sorry, not the reflexive. It means that they would be doing it against each other, right? But then in this one, I believe it says, don't be caused to be grieved. In other words, don't let anything affect the state that I just positioned you in. Let's look back again. What is the first thing that he says to them? In verse 5, draw near. They draw near. Therefore, they are in what? A covenant state with him. And then what happens? Now do not be grieved or angry. You see the difference between the invitation to come to the place of honor versus approaching the place of the honor have to do with presumption. And Judah had to be presumptuous. Judah had to. He had to deliver his brother. But now he says, draw near, and they draw near. And now he says, do not live in this wound. Look at this. For God sent me ahead of you to save lives, for the preservation of life. For famine has been in the land these 2 years, and there are still 5 years in which there will be neither plowing nor harvesting. Remember the rainbow, seed time and harvest? Put on pause for a minute. So God then sent me ahead of you to ensure for you a remnant on the earth and to keep you alive by a great deliverance. They delivered themselves by selling Joseph into slavery. Was it the way in which he was supposed to go to Egypt? No, I have a funny feeling like Isaac was supposed to go to Egypt like Abraham did, and Jacob was supposed to go to Egypt like Isaac would have. Joseph is the only one who actually moves in the proper direction. Because of what? Because of covenant, which I'm going to explain in a minute. Now, therefore, it was not you who sent me here, but God. And he has made me a father to Pharaoh and Lord of all his household and ruler over all the land of Egypt. Hurry up and go to my father and say to him, this is what your son Joseph says. God has made me Lord of all Egypt. Come down to me and do not delay. Look at verse 10. And you shall live in the land of Goshen. Okay, there's the first mention of the word Goshen. So who says it first? Joseph, or did he? We'll see that in a second. And then he says, or then Pharaoh finds out, right? So Pharaoh finds out and says, oh, yeah, say to your brothers, do this, load your livestock, go to the land of Canaan, take your father and your households and come to me, and I will give you the best of the land. Right? Now you are ordered to do this. Take the wagons, the land of Egypt for you little ones, right? Da, 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 da. Get all that stuff. Come down. And then Joseph says, don't quarrel, right? And so then now it's time for them to go get Jacob. They go get Jacob. They bring him, bring him word. He says, okay. Then Jacob goes to Beersheba. Then there's the mention of all these people, right? And the one question we didn't get into, but then look what it says. It says, when Pharaoh calls to you and says, what's your occupation? You will say, we have been keepers of livestock, right? And both we and our fathers, so that you may live in the land of Goshen. Joseph is trying to arrange for them to go to Goshen. And Joseph went to Pharaoh and told Pharaoh and said, my father and my brothers and their flocks and their herds and all that they have come out of the land. And behold, they are in the land of Goshen. And then he says, then Pharaoh says, and they also said to Pharaoh, we have come to reside in the land, and there is no pasture for your servants' flocks, for the famine is severe in the land of Canaan. Now, therefore, let us, your servants, live in the land of Goshen. Then Pharaoh says to Joseph, your father and brothers have come to you. The land of Egypt is at your disposal. Settle your father and your brothers in the best of the land. Let them live in the land of Goshen. So the best of the land is the land of Goshen. And if you know any capable men among them, put them in charge of my livestock, right? And so now it goes on and on and on down to the livestock and all the stuff that happens with the selling of the land and all of those things. Now Israel, not Jacob, lived in the land of Egypt in Goshen. Okay? You ready for it? Here it comes. Land of Goshen. Goshen. Do you remember what the word was? Nagash. It's a permutation of the word Nagash. Nun. Gimel. Shin. So what are the common letters? Gimel, Shin. What does Goshen mean? Drawing near. It's used 15 times in all of the King James Version of the Bible, starting in 45:10, where Joseph says it first. But how did it come about? What is the drawing near? Approaching an authority, coming to the place of honor, either presumptuously or non-presumptuously. Who did it first? Who led the pack? Who showed Joseph that Goshen would be the place? What's the name of our parasha? And he approached. Nagash, a permutation of Goshen. Same gematria. Same gematria. Same number values. No matter which way you put these letters, they will have the same numbering, the same calculation. And it's all about that right there. Because Israel had to be bound in order to become the perfect vessel. In order for Israel to be the bride of the Creator, Israel had to be willful and sovereign first, and then approach and become bound. Right? Become bound. Become covenanted. Become overshadowed in a state of what? That right there. In a state of intimacy, of drawing near. In what place? In the best of the binding. So now, we understand, as the sun sets and Shabbat ends, we'll touch upon this wisdom, that the bride has to come into a state of binding before she can become the vessel. That binding is the covenant promise. You will dwell in the land of Goshen while you are bound. In other words, while you come into this state of humility, because you cannot approach without humility. When it says we come boldly before the throne of God, you need to understand that's by invitation alone, not presumption. We come boldly before the throne of God because we have a right to it. That's what Paul was talking about. He was talking about walk into the throne room and hope you don't get the axe. Await your invitation. Your invitation will result in you having to humble yourself by sitting at the end of the table and being invited to the position of honor by which you would then be the sovereign and not God. You see, American Christianity wants to contingent their lives upon the will of God, not realizing that the will of God was a partnership, connection, agreement of covenant. Covenant is not contractual. One breach does not result in a breaking. And a breaking does not result in an annulment. Each party individually has to carry out their parts. And if neither party does, then the covenant is broken. Isn't it interesting that in this name of this place, we would find covenant in operation? The flocks of Jacob become the flocks of the 1.2 million Israelites who leave Egypt in Shemot, in Exodus. The flocks of Jacob that he inherited through covenant activation. The flocks of Jacob who Pharaoh told him to leave in Canaan. And notice, no one else acknowledges it as the land of promise, like Joseph when he's in prison and says, it is not fair that I was taken from the land of the Hebrews. It is the land of the Hebrews. And I'm going to propose to you that in that sense, we really need to identify a concept here. Because what is Mitzrayim? It's outside the tent. You see, inside the tent is provision, protection, and instruction. Mitzrayim is outside the tent. But what does it say? It says, do not fret because of evildoers who prosper in the way. Trust in the Lord and do good. Dwell in the land and feed off of his faithfulness. In the land of Mitzrayim, in the land of your bindings, in the land of your humility. Be invited to draw near. In the land of your bindings, when you accept that if you want to be the bride, you have to let go of that sovereignty. But then the next thing that happens is that sovereignty is restored in that you are positioned in the position of honor as the inheritor, sovereign owner of the inheritance, while the grantor of the trust is still alive. And in principle, what we're really getting at here is that Vayigash is thematically connected to Yeshua's prayer when he said, you sent me to tell them about everlasting life, and everlasting life is knowing you. And Adam knew his wife and she conceived. Knowing is the filling of the vessel to the point of conception. Remember, we have inception, reception, conception. And in that, we have the whole entire existence of the principle of a sovereign energy being, more the source of all intelligence, the source of all energy, the source of all consciousness, desiring to bestow all of its benevolence upon an other, something other than itself. And so he creates the first vessel, the first bride, who has to go through all of the channels of the responsibility of the bride. Let me tell you a secret. When I was first studying this out, somebody asked me to teach on the responsibility of the bride. I began to study out the word kalala and realized that it was related to the word keli, and it was related to the word yakal. Those were all within the parent root of kaf lamed. I got sleepy. I took a nap. I had a dream that a rabbi came to me, opened a scroll, and pointed at the word kaf yod lamed. I was like, this isn't in that set. This isn't in that set. It's the sovereign woman being joined as a vessel and becoming the bride, the one whose dowry is paid. I woke up from the dream. I had argued with the rabbi. I woke up from the dream, and immediately I said, it's got to be in there. It's got to be a word. I looked in there and it said prisoner, and I about fell over. I was like, oh my gosh, this is it. This is that concept of the captive bride in Deuteronomy 20:21, I believe it is. This is the concept of the woman whose life is preserved from the foreign nation who's been defeated because they were obstinate against covenant. You say, oh, that's a whole bunch of genocide and blah, blah, blah. You know what? Spare me, because let me tell you, the commandment to commit those acts of cleansing, as it were because they were what? They were sacrificing humans and drinking their blood. They were torturing animals and drinking their blood. And worst of all, those humans a lot of times needed to be prepubescent virgins. Yeah, pretty nice nation, right? And so in principle, when we look at the whole, we find all these crazy things. If you desire a woman when you are delivering the world from this wicked nation, this is the process she has to go through. She has to become bound. And then has to what? Go through the process of becoming a stable vessel. Goshen is the faithfulness within the binding, because the bride never actually goes through the suffering of the bush. She doesn't go through the suffering of the cistern. That's what Joseph said. He said, it's not fair that I was placed in the cistern of this prison when I was kidnapped from the land of the Hebrews. The same word that's used for the word pit that he was thrown into by his brothers. So he has a double cistern, but what does he do with his brothers? He puts them under shamar. He guards them as if he were in covenant with them. Later, he says, you didn't sell me to Egypt, God did. How many of you can reframe your Egypt like that? And then Yahweh tells Jacob, if you want to complete this marriage covenant, you have to go into a binding, but I will be there in the best of the land, the drawing near. The name of the place that was predestined by Joseph to be the best of the land, probably where they got the bumper crops, was the land of Goshen. And when the famine was over, and there and people had already bought food, so they had already given up their money, and then they gave up their livestock, and then they gave up their land, Goshen did not have that happen to them, because that was Joseph's land. And so the only sovereign land that was left after the land purchases for food, in which it says, then Pharaoh gave them grain and seed to go plant as slaves or as servants of Pharaoh. The people of Egypt completely relinquished all sovereign private property in return for food. And when the famine was over, they were sent to go plant again. And the only land that was not purchased was the land of Goshen. The only land that Pharaoh didn't own was Joseph's land. So Judah, as the Messiah, preserves the inheritor. Who's the inheritor? Us. Why? Because he always chooses the second-born. It says that Yeshua was the firstborn amongst many brethren. Who's those many brethren? Us. In other words, what it is saying is we're positioned at the end of the table. Yeshua steps away and we go and sit in that state of sovereignty as the inheritor. And the angels are sent as ministering spirits to those who would inherit salvation, who would inherit Yeshua. That's what that word is in Hebrew, salvation. And so consequently, the thought process here and the mysticism behind it is not only that when you go into a state of contraction, balance will follow. But when you are in a state of balance, abundance or expansion follows. Goshen prospered and was in a state of abundance, while the rest of the land went into a state of contraction in which Pharaoh received all private property but Joseph's.
So, verse 28 of chapter 46 is really kind of standing out to me at this second. Actually, while you were giving a lot of that information, it's been popping out at me. And it says, I'm reading out of the Sefer here, and it says, and he sent Judah before him unto Joseph to direct his face unto Goshen, and they came into the land of Goshen. So he sent Judah, who is the one who came near to Joseph, to set his face, give him the direction to draw near. I think the reason why it's kind of really been standing out to me and why I spoke up when I did is because when you said that as the inheritors, Yeshua is the first inheritance, right? He is the firstborn. But as heirs to the throne, he gives us the ability to come to that seat of honor as well. But he showed the way or the path to do so. He directed us to how to do it. And this verse is just sticking out to me, how to draw near. Give me the direction on how to draw near.
Mm-hmm. When we think about the context of Egypt, it serves its purpose and it has its place, but it is not somewhere where we are supposed to stay. The bride does not stay bound. She is bound for a reason. You see, what people don't realize, who's in the loins of Judah as his face is pointed towards Goshen? Who's in the loins of Judah as he's commanded by Jacob to lead everyone else to Goshen through the instruction of his brother Joseph, thereby establishing that Joseph is in the state of the right hand, but Judah is in the state of Joseph's right hand, right? And the principle is that Judah would inherit the scepter. But who's in the loins? David, Solomon, Yeshua. Kings of the earth will come out of the loins of Judah. But who started it? Who actually did Yigash first? I'm sorry, Nagash first. A woman. And that woman drew near to Judah because Judah would not do what his soul was telling him to do. The Messiah was in his loins. How do we know that? Because Paul speaks of the Messiah being in Abraham's loins. Of Levi being in Abraham's loins when Levi pays a tithe. I shouldn't say Paul, it's the writer of Hebrews. When Levi pays a tithe to Melchizedek, thus making Melchizedek the higher order of priesthood, which is a Noahic promise order, not a Israelite promise order. See, the Levitical priesthood is contingent upon the Israelites, but the Melchizedekan priesthood is contingent upon the entire earth. I'm sorry, constituent upon. And what's important about that is in the sense of covenant. But the special thing about this is that Tamar was the first to draw near and taught Judah how to draw near presumptuously and taught Judah how to step into a position that he's not supposed to be in without invitation in order to activate messiahship, to deliver the son of Jacob's right hand. And from that, Joseph says, okay, the gematria says that you just drew near, and I am going to give you the land that I named drawing near. Therefore, that's the land where we will dwell because of what you just did. But it's really what Tamar did because Judah would not listen to his soul. When Judah finally did listen to his soul, he said, "You're a better person than me." And then Judah starts to step up to the plate and do what he's supposed to do. But what's intriguing is how Goshen is the result of Tamar's choice to preserve that which was in the loins of Judah, that Judah evidently just couldn't get his head wrapped around. It was a woman. Just like when Israel was in a state of chattel slavery to the foreign armies, and Devorah delivers Israel through her prophecy that a woman would receive the credit. You see, however we work this out, we need to understand that when a woman is overshadowed by a man, it does not give a man carte blanche ownership of that woman to command her as if she is some sort of animal with a bridle in her mouth. Does the binding have to occur? Yes, because she has to release the sovereignty in order for it to come back in a higher order. That Yakal is the power, right? Translated in Greek as dunamis. She comes into a binding, humble thyself in the sight of the Lord, and he will raise you up into a position of honor as a vessel that can receive, a keli. And thereby, as she is filled, she becomes a kalala or kala, depending on who you ask. I find two lameds to sound like this, la, but it may be that it's assimilated. So in principle, Goshen has the same gematria as the verb nagash, which is in a imperfect state with a conjunctive vav altering its time state. I will draw near becomes, or I'm sorry, he will draw near, which is a faithful belief in a promise, becomes he drew near with the conjunctive vav. And as the noon gets dropped and the yod is added, it goes into a state of imperfect promise, but then the vav alters it and causes it to become present tense. So, in principle, the concept that needs to be gained here is that Jacob has to leave his tent and go out and begin to tame the livestock of Pharaoh in the land of drawing near while bound. And that binding is taking the prosperity that he has, humbling himself and allowing God to be the provider. Remember, the whole principle here is there was no longer any food in Canaan for their livestock. To become the Kili, the perfect vessel, which is the bride of the Creator, as a result of receiving after the fact. And that's that principle of elevation through humility, the idea of getting under and rising up something in order to be risen up. That's the principle of elevation. And so, isn't it amazing that Jacob's story ends with the promise that his son, who was his intended inheritor from the beginning, would close his eyes. His son, who he wanted to give the inheritance to, that is who would close his eyes. So the story of Joseph is one of the most difficult to navigate because us humans can't accept that suffering could happen for a purpose and not because it was merited. Joseph declares, "It is not fair. I am not merited to be in this dungeon, in this pit, in this in this boor. I am not merited to be in this boor because I was kidnapped from the land of the Hebrews," declaring his position, not the Canaanites, the Hebrews. He speaks to his brothers, Ani Yosef. He speaks the language of the spiritual to those who believed that he was not spiritual, and asks them to draw near, come up to the position of honor. Yes, you're in table fellowship. Fine. Sitting at the end of the table, you're in table fellowship. I approve of you sitting at my table, but I want you up here with me at my right hand. that you would inherit what I have. And all that Joseph had in Goshen, he gave to his brothers. The rest of Egypt went into a state of servitude, of indentured service to Pharaoh, legitimate indentured service, because of the debt they owed, because of the food they received, except for Goshen, except for his brothers, except for his father while he was still alive. So that is the Rabbi's Nugget this week. Any thoughts? Does anybody out there on the Zoom call wish to comment? Well, we cannot say Shabbat Shalom because the sun is set. We can say Shavua Tov, have a sweet week, and we will begin the count again to the next Shabbat, starting with day 1 tomorrow, the first day of the week. But in the meanwhile, remember that even in your bindings, you can dwell in the land and feed off of his faithfulness. Even in bindings, you can trust in the Lord and do good. The bindings serve for a season. I want to show you one last thing, actually. Just thought of this. What did the children of Israel try to do when they did not enter the promised land?
What did they try? They tried to go in by themselves.
They tried to go back to Egypt.
Oh, yes.
The binding is for a season. It serves a purpose, and you cannot stay in it. When you are moved out of it, that is it. The binding is for a season, not forever. And you can definitely prosper within the binding. Shavua Tov.